Make them free, and they will quickly become wise and virtuous, said Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of modern feminism, speaking from the latter passages of her most famous philosophical treatise, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. This work was urged on by her publisher and championed by her husband, the journalist, novelist, and philosophical anarchist William Godwin. Vindication would be published in 1792. 5 years later, freshly returned from the French Revolution and somewhat jaded by her experience of it, Mary Wollstonecraft would die of puerperal fever about 11 days after giving birth to the future novelist who would become known as Mary Shelley. If you're fascinated by stories of intellectual firebrands who lived during interesting times, you could do a lot worse than the nexus of Wollstonecraft, Godwin, the Shelleys, Lord Byron, John Polidori, and others in their circle. We're going to take on these luminaries of Victorian Great Britain, for the light their lives and works may shine upon our own. My name is Mark Vanderpool, and you're listening to Hyperion Midnight. In this episode, we will be ramping up to a full exploration of a very important artistic, philosophical, and social movement called Romanticism. We're going to dispel some myths of minor pejorative versions of what Romanticism means, and we're going to look at how it's situated in relation to the 18th century Enlightenment. Is Romanticism a reaction to, or a part of, the Enlightenment and its reasoning? We're going to understand it against the backdrop of revolution. We're going to perceive it in historical context as a resistance to the rise of urbanization and industrial capitalism. And we're going to figure out how all of these enormous energies become distilled into a gothic horror novel written by a teenager that people still read 200 years later. We're going to go looking for Frankenstein's creature, and instead of Boris Karloff dolled up into an inarticulate zombie with a flat head, something that has become a caricature of itself, we're going to find something else instead. We're going to explore philosophy and society through the lens of art, perhaps our finest mirror. The tension between Enlightenment rationalism and the spirit of Romanticism, in a proper understanding of the term, present items of abiding interest to us as Hyperions and as human beings. To explore Frankenstein in any depth, you must understand the second-born daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, her first child with William Godwin, and oh my God, what it must have been like to be her. But first, I want you to put the psychoanalysis cap on as we come face to face with Mary Shelley's truly formidable mother. Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797, a moral philosopher with breathtaking comprehension of the human condition, particularly through the lens of every artificial overlay foisted upon her at the time and in the culture of her birth, almost entirely by virtue of being a woman. Wollstonecraft thought that women should be educated as men were educated, treated as minds capable of reason, and not filled with facile biases and polite manners, rendering them fit only to be appendages to a man. And she was having and expressing eloquently these essentially core feminist thoughts pretty much before anybody else. To understand Mary Wollstonecraft as a founding feminist thinker, it's helpful to see her in the first place as very much an 18th century Enlightenment philosopher in her own right. She is a rationalist, and that is to say she always expresses the inherent presupposition that reality works as a unified whole, and that people, by the exercise of reason, may participate in that greater reality. in a more fully human, fit, and dignified way. Wollstonecraft proceeds from general axioms into particular material when she fashions an argument. She doesn't just wade in there and sling things off the cuff. And she can be just sweet and absolutely blistering at the same time. She could have had more than tea or wild fun or witty repartee with old Jean-Jacques Rousseau if the esteemed Frenchman had lived long enough to know her in her maturity. She takes up Rousseau's thinking as a favorite springboard and sparring partner in her vindication, and she sends him packing. Le mec is scotched. She sends him home with his ass neatly served and stored in a couple of Ziploc bags, if you will forgive me this one tiny vulgar anachronism, with a turn of phrase and image she never would have used. And there's a little note on one of those Ziploc bags with thoughtful reheating directions, I'm sure. It's possible that it's written in both English and French. Courtesy. Wollstonecraft is formidable. She occasionally references God in her philosophical treatises in a manner that shows no categorical scorn for the concept of a supreme being, but then she neatly compartmentalizes and partitions all of her moral concerns, keeping them away from that brightest light, those speculative metaphysical questions regarding the nature and ground of being and so on, as belonging to a domain perhaps as Kant would have it beyond our reckoning. But there can be no appeal to scripture, tradition, patriarchy, authority, faith, or superstition in her presence when it comes to how one ought to live and what duties we owe to one another. Wollstonecraft is a moral philosopher, and she's fierce and unrelenting in her premise that a mature and properly educated mind may know with certainty how to reason regarding any moral question, any question of human conduct or manners, arriving at the correct answer through the virtuous exercise of explicable and axiomatic reasoning. No guesswork, no appeal to faith, no maybe. Maybe you'll arrive at a just consideration for right conduct if you pray and have faith. No, it may happen to coincide with the will of God. No, none of that. No dithering about it. She's tough. For Mary Wollstonecraft, any mature and sufficiently educated human mind will arrive at a God's eye view on questions of justice and right conduct through the autonomous exercise of reason. But to get there requires a great deal of independence. The will of the deity is simple, clear, and waiting there for you in her estimation. It is necessarily synonymous with the full and virtuous exercise of your own reasoning nature. She's very much in tune with the Hellenistic Stoics on this point. The central problem for Wollstonecraft, of course, is that both the European continental and the British societies of roughly 200 years ago are a long damn way from treating the sexes equally in the realm of education. She's a sport of nature herself, an anomaly, in being able to reason as well as any man, and Wollstonecraft is acutely aware that most of the riggings of her society tend against the development of the very kind of thinker she is in a woman. Give her writings the time and attention they deserve, and she will make her case for herself even better than I can recap. And did I mention that she only lived to be about 37 years old? Her lifetime occupies a little more than the latter third of the 18th century. Mary Wollstonecraft died in 1797, just 3 years from the turn of the century, due to complications after the delivery of her second daughter, the Mary named for her, who will become Mary Shelley. Puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, was a common affliction at the time. And to lose a luminary rationalist philosopher and founder of modern feminism to childbed fever in 1797, it's a bone-chilling irony. The almost exclusively male medical establishment, comprised of the sort of general practitioners of medicine who made good old-fashioned English house calls during this time, was not completely ignorant of the germ theory of disease. The germ theory of disease is a landmark idea in the history of ideas, a major improvement for humankind. It comes maybe a little after the invention of the wheel or the control of fire in importance, but much later in history, of course. It comes a little before we get to the discovery of penicillin and the particular uses of antibiotics, which are contingent on the core idea that there's something invisible to treat. But there was a time when it was controversial that tiny, invisible monsters called germs had anything to do with disease. There was a time when you might sound like a kook, like a wild-eyed occultist, if you presented establishment medicine with a discourse on the necessity of fighting germs while washing your hands before a procedure. By the time Mary Wollstonecraft is giving birth to Mary Shelley, the leading experts have given credence to the germ theory of disease, but the notion is still contested. It is not favored by physicians in the field who simply do not want to believe that they could have contributed to a patient's death at any time from something as simple as not washing their hands. And it isn't a standard of practice to always wash your hands before delivering a baby. It just hasn't quite made it into conventional medicine. And of course, no one has invented latex or latex gloves, so it wasn't all that uncommon for a physician to go directly from participating in an autopsy or something equally gross to making a house call and assisting in the delivery of a baby. And they might wash their hands in between, perhaps, the gross effluvium removed in some porcelain bowl filled with stagnant well water or the urban equivalent, and they might not. Maybe a towel would do. There is no hand sanitizer. Nothing in the medical bag or the immediate environment has the label antibacterial on it. Mary Wollstonecraft's physician had to enter the birth canal manually and remove a part of the placenta with his bare hands after the delivery. His late 18th century, unwashed doctor hands set her up for an infection. A completely illiterate maidservant witch could have attended her in the role of midwife, and she would have been better off. That's where we are 200 years ago in British history. Romanticism, especially when seen as a counter-movement to the Enlightenment, is distrustful of easy narratives of science and progress. It is distrustful of totalizing solutions and all traditional standards of authority. As a cultural, philosophical, and artistic movement, Romanticism is generally deemed to occupy the latter half of the 18th century, when Mary Wollstonecraft lived, through the first half of the 19th century, ending roughly in 1850 or so, not all that far in time from the year Mary Shelley died. So English Romanticism starts with Wordsworth, Coleridge, and it shares energy with the French Revolution during Mary Wollstonecraft's lifetime, and then it sort of wraps up as a pivotal movement during the daughter's lifetime. At the dawn of the 19th century, the 1800s, there was a little girl growing up in her brilliant father's house. She is intellectually nourished, but emotionally deprived. Her jealous stepmother, like a fairy tale notion, compels old man Godwin to establish more distance between himself and Mary, and to pay more attention to her children from before the marriage and to the one child they've gone on to have together. Mary is caught between these experiences, adrift. She is educated without the tributaries of formal or public schooling, so her existence is somewhat insular. This is not to say that her mind could be left behind at all. What ordinary school compares to having the radical anarchist social philosopher William Godwin for your dad, and everything your mother wrote for your mother? Your mother, the feminist firebrand, who will remain underrated as a philosopher in her own right up through the 20th century and beyond, based on the very things she criticized. What universe would you need for the unfoldment of your mind as young Mary Shelley, larger than your father's house? What boundaries pertain when your father's house is a place familiar to old Samuel Taylor Coleridge himself, who shows up one night and performs the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner for the pleasure of guests in the parlor, while you and your sister hide behind the furniture so you can listen to it all? How does it rest with you when you walk past the unused bedroom at the top of the stairs that once was filled with the instruments of life and death, as she comes to phrase it in Frankenstein, filled with those instruments of life and death in the days immediately following your birth. That death chamber where your mother departed the world perhaps takes on an unholy aspect when you walk past it at night, knowing. Does this lead to the place in imagination where monsters are born? Oh, but before we go too far down the darkest corridors, I wanted to invite you to an experience of a vindication of the rights of woman, so you can decide for yourself whether I've overstated my case for the brilliance of Mary Wollstonecraft. You can even listen to it if you're keen on the audiobook experience, over or in addition to reading. I can recommend the rendition where the narrator and voice artist who brings the work to life is known as Jan Kramer. That's Jan like Mindful Monad, and Kramer like George Costanza's character on Seinfeld, except with a C, I believe, not a K. You can find that version of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman on Amazon's audiobook platform Audible for free. Just type in Mary Wollstonecraft as your search term at Audible, and it will appear amid the very top results. What could stop you from having that experience for free? Fair warning, with Wollstonecraft, you will encounter words that fall a little outside most early 21st century basic English users walking around vocabulary. Some of those words are appearing now on the screen for YouTube viewers, and I will also copy them into the description for anyone who might be curious but visually impaired. Her language is crisp and not gigantically florid by Victorian standards. The words in question are not obsolete or amusingly antique. For the most part, they won't reach right out and grab you by your conscious attention. So we aren't going back to the Elizabethans here. There's no need to study Middle English to get through the text. We're not reading Chaucer. The journey we're on isn't the Canterbury Tales. So my concern is that the upper end of Wollstonecraft's vocabulary will seem familiar enough to just let it ride. Whenever an exact meaning isn't clear to you, you'll make an inference based on context and move on, like smart readers usually do. But the danger there is you'll drift into a brain fog when too many misunderstood words land on your cerebellum or wherever those things land. But if you take 5-10 seconds to look it up and get a precise definition with an online dictionary for those words slightly beyond everyday walking around vocabulary, that will pay huge dividends to your total comprehension. And everybody should know what sensibility means, just for instance, before going into this text. In terms of cultural literacy, it will aid your comprehension to be familiar enough with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, old JJ, with Locke, Hume, Hobbes, and a few others, to understand all the textual references to those thinkers. A deeper understanding will only make it more fun when she takes old J.J. Rousseau to the woodshed and so on. However, this level of familiarity falls into the category of nice but not necessary. Please do not tell yourself that you must read or reread Rousseau before you can take up Wollstonecraft. The extent to which her arguments depend upon references to previous thinkers is subtle and very slight. In terms of historical context, it's amazingly helpful just to remind ourselves that she's writing from about 200 years ago. British society is extremely classist and stiff. It is overwhelmingly patriarchal. Women are treated in many ways like pets, or like children who never grow up, or like a fancy kind of livestock one keeps. So when her sense of propriety makes her seem a little stuffy or old-fashioned, or maybe impossibly stoic or something like that, counterbalance that with the awareness that she's extraordinarily radical in historical context. And enjoy it. The conversational possibilities this opens up, and the depth it will add to our future discussions is enormous. This is just part one of our deep dive into Frankenstein. What do I think Hyperions will gain from putting in the work I here suggest? Hyperliteracy, of course. File it in your magic toolbox with concept networking. I want more Hyperions to achieve hyperliteracy in 2023, even if we have to Frankenstein it together. Thank you for your kind attention. Part 2 will follow within 1 week's time. If you're finding value in this channel's content, please consider a one-time donation through PayPal, Did I say pain, pal? You can feel me, can't you? Please consider a one-time donation through PayPal or making a purchase through our online store. Links in the description. Signing off for Hyperion Midnight, this is Mark Vanderpool. Happy New Year, and Hail New Terra!